Welcome to the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition's Advocacy Network Town Hall. I am Kimberly Limore. I am on the executive committee for the CPMC and your host for today. We are excited that you have decided to spend time with us this next hour discussing issues and legislation on human trafficking. We have a wonderful guest, and we will open that up in a bit. First, as usual, I will start off with a prayer. I will introduce our speaker, and later on, we will open and leave time for questions and answers. As the presentation is going forth, if a question comes to mind, feel free to put it in the chat, and we will make sure that we address it at the end. So let us get into the presence of God. I have a prayer for the end of human trafficking. I think I've used it before. It's shared by the Sisters of Charity of St. Elizabeth in Covenant Station, New Jersey. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God of freedom, beauty, and truth. We believe that your deepest desire, your most powerful energy, is that all creation might know abundant life. We raise our voices in anguished prayer for our sisters and brothers, women and girls, men and boys, who are modern day slaves. They are your beloved daughters and sons, exploited sexually or forced to work because of human violence and greed. Fill us with your holy anger and your sacred passion, that those who are trafficked might know healing and know your justice, that traffickers will come to repentance and conversion, that all of us might live in such a way that others are not made to pay the price for our comfort and convenience. Hasten the coming of the day when all people of our precious earth itself will be treated not as a commodity, but as radiant images of your freedom, your beauty, and your truth. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So today we are excited to welcome Marilyn Zigmund Luke, who is the Director of Advocacy of the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking. She leads and coordinates the organization's public policy and legislative advocacy activities and campaigns. As the advocacy director, she serves as a visionary, adaptive leader who models the USC AEHT's mission, visions, and values. Marilyn has worked with all levels of government, federal, state, and local, and she has over 25 years of professional experience with both public and private sector organizations. Again, we welcome to our town hall on today, Marilyn Zigmund Luke.
Well, thank you.
Via Zoom.
Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you for the beautiful prayer, the nice introduction, and I really want to send a shout out and thank you to Courtney and Kara and Karen for inviting me this afternoon. I'm happy to be with other folks who feel that they are advocates on behalf of individuals and organizations. So I'm really happy to share some time with you today. What I thought we would do is start out in terms of our slides, just really giving an overview of what we hope to accomplish today. And so that'll include, I'm going to go very quickly through some content about the overview of human trafficking. I know that you've had others come and speak about that, and so I won't spend a lot of time there. I'm going to go very quickly through what our perspective is in terms of the prison ministry, and then we'll focus the majority of our time on combating human trafficking through advocacy, and then talking about the way forward, which for all of us is really our prayer and our partnership for action. So we can go ahead and jump ahead to the slide, Courtney, that talks about our organization. I want to explain the goal of the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking. And I think it's probably best to do that by understanding how we originated and where this work came from. And so 10 years ago, there were 15 sisters who were doing anti-trafficking work throughout the United States. And they really felt that there needed to be more momentum and concentrated focus. So they came together in Washington, D.C. over a period of 3 days to figure out what they could do because they were the ones on the ground doing the work. And they met with a number of representatives, not just from congregations, but they also pulled in other groups, government officials, from the Polaris Project as well, private sector people. And they talked about what they could do to really combine efforts and get attention to this very important topic. And so through their work, it actually became a national issue. We now have a national network, and the sisters serve not just for the voice within congregations, but really the public voice and a corporate voice for the issue of human trafficking. We recently had our 10-year conference, and I think it was really telling. One of the founders of the organization said she viewed it as a mustard seed ministry. There were just this small group trying to figure out what they could do to try and stop human trafficking. And that effort has now grown to a full organization. We have a number of employees. We have over 100 congregations and many, many members. So through our members and our volunteers, you can really see that those few steps 10 years ago have really blossomed into something that's much more wholesome and we hope effective. So the next slide explains how our organization is going to move forward. We recently went through a process called rebranding, and essentially that just means we've changed our name and we want to make sure that we're clear about what our focus is. So the Sisters, of course, we are a collaborative, faith-based national network working to eradicate modern-day slavery. But we are trying to expand that really to anyone who has a calling or sees it as their mission to combat human trafficking. So our new name, the Alliance to End Human Trafficking, is intended to incorporate different faiths. It's intended to incorporate folks from any walk of life. As I mentioned, it's really just someone who wants to eradicate human trafficking as the modern day scourge. And we do this through a number of ways. Of course, we have to inform the public. So we do a lot of education. We do a lot of outreach with respect to that. We'll talk in a bit about some media campaigns, what we're doing in terms of federal, state, and local work. And we also have an international focus. The thing that I think is important about our mission and our vision is that we are a member of Talitha Kum, and that is an international intercongregational system of sisters that really hopes to promote initiatives to stop the trafficking in persons based on individual contexts and cultures. And Talitha Kum is important because trafficking as it occurs in the US is very different than what's happening in Africa, the Philippines, and others. So through that, we have a full network to really have an onslaught of advocates working on all different aspects. And in terms of our organization and our focus, we've got a couple of different areas that we focus on. Advocacy, which we'll be talking about today. We also act as a referral source for survivor services. So for those who have actually been survivors of human trafficking, we have a network to refer them and help that. We are not a direct service provider, but we do have those resources available. As I mentioned, we do a lot of education. And of course, a key component of our work and our vision has to do with faith resources. So you'll be hearing a bit about a prayer campaign that we're going to be starting and some additional efforts with respect to that. So Courtney, if we could move to the next few slides, I want to just flash through some very quick definitions and statistics. And I know that many of you know this and are familiar with this and have heard it. I offer this slide simply for those who may be new to the group or who may be new to the issue of human trafficking. It is a crime under federal, state, local, international law. And when we talk about human trafficking, from the time that I've been with the organization, folks say to me, well, Marilyn, what is it? Isn't it only just sex trafficking? And actually, it's not. It includes sex trafficking, but it also includes labor trafficking. It includes things like child soldiers, mail order brides, forced marriages, organ removal, anything with respect to those categories we consider to be human trafficking. And so the next slide includes a number of statistics that have been cited from a number of sources. And I guess the thing that I would caution is we say that we have an estimate in terms of the victims. Human trafficking is, I think, probably one of the most underreported crimes. And so while folks intend to try and get some statistics around this, I think that it's probably much higher than what we have anticipated or expected, simply because it tends to be something that operates in the shadows, and victims tend to have a lot of shame and not being willing to come forward. The thing that really is striking about human trafficking, and folks often think, well, it goes hand in hand with drug trafficking and human smuggling and other things. With human trafficking, a drug can be sold only once. But the reason traffickers get involved in human trafficking is because victims can be sold multiple times per day, 15 to 30 times per day. And it's really estimated that there's over 50 million people that have been ensnared in human trafficking in some form or other. So in the next slide, I've listed out a series of vulnerabilities, I would say, that help us identify those who are subject to human trafficking. And really what it comes down to is focusing on the vulnerable. One of the reasons that I really enjoy working with the sisters is because that is the mission of their ministry and their life work. They look to see the people in the shadows and give them a voice. And so primarily they focus on women and children, but I think in the context of human trafficking, it really can happen to anyone. It can happen to boys, it can happen to men. Human trafficking is something that affects really all walks of life, all socioeconomic situations. And the reason for that is because it targets folks in different areas of human vulnerability. We've been hearing a lot about individuals who have special needs are becoming targets, that there really has to be some want of love and feeling of powerlessness and lack of self-worth. All of that the human traffickers thrive on. So in preparing for today, on the next slide, I thought I would come up with just some recent articles from the past week in terms of human trafficking. And if you go to any of the search engines online, I think that you'll see an onslaught of different publications that have been put out, different press articles relating to human trafficking. It can be anywhere from one victim to hundreds to thousands. And while I think it's important to highlight some of what's going on in the press, it's helpful because at least now the public is getting aware that, yes, human trafficking is happening. Whether you live in a small town or in a big city, it's happening in your area. But it really saddens me because it is so prolific throughout the nation, and because it is really in every part of the country, whether it's rural, whether it's urban, human trafficking is occurring. So I've given some articles there really to give a flavor of the type of things that have happened within the past week. You can certainly go and look for others. It is something that I think in the past few months has become much more visible in terms of the media, and which is why it really is our mission in terms of advocacy to make sure that we can not only get the message out about human trafficking, but what to do in response to it. So I know many of you are focused on the prison ministry. And if we could jump ahead, Courtney, as we move through our discussions this afternoon, I just wanted to pose some questions for your consideration. We don't have to answer these today, but these are questions that I thought we could take a minute just to ponder, because as you're moving through your work and as you're doing advocacy, it's important to keep some of these parameters in mind. And when we talk about incarceration, it's typically thought of as punishment for a criminal act. But in the area of human trafficking, we have to always stop and think, what if the person being punished is actually the victim? They're the victim of human trafficking. It was a surprise to some when I was preparing for the presentation and consulting with a number of external people that they felt that they didn't realize trafficking could actually happen to somebody who's incarcerated. And actually, in speaking with the sisters and our volunteers who do this work, it was very apparent to me that incarceration itself can create vulnerability to trafficking. So I encourage you to think about what education should we do and to whom should we direct that education? Are there individuals who are incarcerated that are even aware that they can be trafficked while they're in prison or in jail? Are individuals who are incarcerated aware that trafficking can happen once they're released? If a trafficking victim himself or herself is incarcerated, once they get out, will it really be free? Or will they be put back into the cycle of trafficking and sale? You know, I've heard from some of our sisters who have done this ministry that, and I'm sure many of you know, the pimps will often post bail or make sure that they get someone who has been trafficked out of prison, because once they're back on the street, they can get them back into the cycle. So thinking about that as we move through some of our considerations. And I know that you recently had someone come and speak about minors and juveniles. I think it's important in terms of trafficking to think about, with our advocacy, what special consideration should we be asking for with respect to minors and juveniles? And in our ministries, what should we be doing to advocate? And how do we go about doing that? So the next slide gives a very broad overview, and I know many of you have heard this before, about the incarcerated as vulnerable targets. And what we refer to them in terms of the Alliance, we call them trackers. And these are the folks who are involved in human trafficking that really view this as a business. They're very good at understanding who can they look to trap. How do they go about getting them involved in human trafficking? Through recruiting, oftentimes tricks. And they do research. They can go to websites. They can figure out who might be in jail for different violations. And then they target those folks with the hope of enslaving them. I won't spend much time on that because the next slide really gives us a sense about who really can be vulnerable either before or after incarceration, and what should we be looking for in terms of some signs. I know that you've heard this before, so I'll offer that slide as a reference, and just want to move on to the next slide in terms of what I'll call a special look on women as vulnerable. So in speaking with one of our sisters, she conveyed to me that really jails and prisons are ideal settings from which traffickers recruit vulnerable women. And the way that she described it to me is, Marilyn, they enslave the enslaved. Women tend to go into or return to what they call survival mode. They're just trying to get through the situation. And the thing that is, I would say, unique about traffickers is they not only know how to work the system, they see institutions as business opportunities. And I don't think many folks understand that perspective or can appreciate it. But folks who are in institutions are viewed as commodities, and the traffickers see this as a business opportunity. So how does this happen? Fellow inmates can refer other women to traffickers because they get money or favors by doing so. Prison staff often can be working with traffickers, whether they turn names or information over to them. And prison websites, which I think in some of the TV shows can be glamorized and, you know, viewed as a mechanism to contact individuals in prison and start relationships, they're actually used by traffickers to do what I call data mining, which is a resource for them to go through and figure out who is vulnerable, who could I target, and identify for recruitment or targeting individuals through these websites. And really, what the trackers do, as I mentioned, they use trauma and isolation to their advantage, but they do it often in ways that are not obvious at first glance. They do it through relationship building. So it can be someone writing letters or making phone calls, trying to help the person understand that, well, your stay in prison is intolerable, and I can help you out. I can give you cash for your commissary account. You can use it for toiletries, get some extra snacks, get extra food. And you know what? I can be here for you after your release. And for the person in prison, it's a diversion. It gets them out of the isolation. It helps with their boredom. And I think what for me is most troubling is it offers somebody hope, but that hope is false hope, only leading them down a path of trafficking and further victimization. So understanding this landscape, I thought we could focus most of our time on how we combat human trafficking through advocacy. So Courtney, if we could jump ahead to the slide that talks about our efforts from the Alliance. I really enjoy working with the sisters because they reflect the core values of our faith. And that can really be boiled down to a couple of key points. They believe in the inherent dignity of every human person, as we all do. And the commitment is really for those who are poor and vulnerable, as I mentioned earlier. But they really want to have themselves and have individuals have the right relationships so that we can promote the common good. And the reason we do this is we're all in solidarity with one another. So that means we share not only in the joys with each other, but also the sorrows and help uplift those who are in need. So in terms of my role for the organization, in the legislative or regulatory context, if we could jump ahead to the next slide, Courtney, I spend a lot of my time in advocacy conveying an ask. So what does that mean? It's any law, regulation, policy, corporate position, something that we want to recommend, change, or get a desired outcome. So in the legislative context, it's often something very basic like veto the bill, pass the bill, amend the bill. Maybe we make suggested changes to a bill. In the regulatory context, it could be something like withdraw the regulation, implement the regulation, change it. And the best way to go about advocacy in the legislative and regulatory context is to support this rationale for your position through your experience and hopefully some research if it's available. But advocacy, as we explain on the next slide, it comes in many forms. Kim mentioned Christmas is going to be coming. For anyone who has children, advocacy has probably already started. They're going to be asking for gifts. They're going to be wanting different things. That's their own form of advocacy. For anyone who's taken care of somebody or helped anyone navigate the healthcare system, you're often an advocate for that person, whether it's to get a bill paid, get a service, advocate for a specific treatment. That's advocacy in that context. Soon we'll be focused on the political environment and political races in different parts of the country. The candidates will be advocating to us, asking us to support their positions and elect them to office. And many charities need money to help their work. We often get advocacy campaigns directed at us or our organizations to really garner support in terms of contributions, volunteer efforts, etc. So all of that, when I talk about advocacy, I intend it very broadly. And advocacy can be anything from advocating for one person on an individual basis, advocating for a specific group, or advocating nationally, as we do in a lot of our legislative and regulatory campaigns. I think the key thing that I want you to take away from my perspective, at least with respect to advocacy, is sometimes people say to me, well, Marilyn, I don't really want to go to the Hill, or I don't want to talk to my representative because I don't work in the political area. I don't do anything with that. I don't follow bills. I really don't know what I would say. And I can tell you from the work that I've done through all of my years in this area is that your experience is your credibility. That is what is the most effective advocacy, because you have the on-the-ground experience to be able to convey the message of those who are involved in your ministry work and on whose behalf you're speaking. But it also can include things like the media. We, at the Alliance, do advertisements. We sometimes do letters to the editor to use that forum to get our messages out. Many of us are on social media, not everyone, but many are on social media to try and get messaging out. We use it as well from the Alliance. Online public forums through these educational websites, YouTube, public statements released by our executive director. If a bill is moving or a specific event occurs, sometimes we issue a public statement for release to hopefully get picked up by the media. We have a number of sisters and volunteers and members who can't travel. Maybe they are no longer able to do in-person visits. They do phone campaigns. They call their representatives. They write letters. They send emails. And in the age of technology, now we can do a lot of these meetings in terms of virtual Zoom platforms, as well as the in-person meetings that I mentioned. So really, what do we hope to accomplish? On the next slide, we have a summary of some of the key things that we focus on at the Alliance. We want to do education. That is a key point in getting individuals to understand what their job is in terms of our representation. We need to raise our voices to support legislation, to support policies and business practices that protect the human rights of all people. The goal, of course, is to end human trafficking, but we have to do that starting with education. And I just want to highlight here, when I talk about business practices, we've got a number of groups in our advocacy work who do what we call corporate advocacy. So they go to corporations and ask them to change things like policies to make sure their contracts have human trafficking provisions, to do training of their employees, to help protect children when they're online with some of the tech platforms. So it really can be very broad in terms of our scope for business, and it's not just limited to bills and regulations. Now, as Karen mentioned earlier, we do a lot of work at the federal, state, and local levels, but we also do relationship building. A lot of advocacy, you'll find that you get involved in supporting a bill and maybe the bill dies or the regulation doesn't get enacted as you want. But part of the message and part of conveying that is really to build positive relationships with legislators and their staff, the regulators, and advocates and other coalitions, which can really help carry your message out. I think it's important to note that with the Alliance, we work across party lines. We don't focus on one specific party. Okay. We don't focus. I'm sorry, was there a question? No. Courtney, should I continue? Okay. We don't focus just specifically on one political party, I was saying, or just religious folks. We work with really anyone who could help get us the result and achieve the eradication of human trafficking. So on the next slide, I am a lawyer, and I've given us what I call a legal snapshot, which are some of the areas that the Alliance works in terms of federal, state, local, and remote advocacy. Now, for those who have dealt with human trafficking through the years, you may be familiar with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which started in 2000. Since then, there have been a number of amendments made to that to really build on the human rights protections provisions. And right now, there are some reauthorization processes that are taking place and some talk about some international protections that may be enacted. So the Alliance is engaging in terms of our federal legislative work on those fronts. We also try to do advocacy in terms of policies and legislation that will prevent human trafficking from taking place. And I'll talk a little bit later about migration and human trafficking. But one of the things that we're going to be seeking is work authorizations for asylum seekers. So when individuals come to the country and they're trying to gain asylum, oftentimes they're not able to work for several months. And because of that, they become vulnerable to human trafficking. So we're doing a lot of work with respect to that. The sisters have spent many years focusing on unaccompanied minors, unaccompanied children. And we're going to be doing some work around additional legal protections for attorneys and a specific court process to help unaccompanied children make sure their rights are protected. We have a number of sisters focused on child safety and online protection laws. There are a number of different bills called COSA, Earn It. They are really trying to target what happens on some of the tech platforms. We've also seen the area of labor as an increasing vulnerability, both because states are hearing from employers that they are not able to get work. And so because of that, they're lowering the age of workers, relaxing some of the restrictions of what younger workers can't do on the job. And we've also been doing some work with respect to individuals who come to the country on a temporary or seasonal basis, primarily our agricultural work. But for the prison ministry, I thought it was important to mention the T and U visas. These are special processes that are available to migrants who have become victims of human trafficking. And depending on the circumstances of each individual situation, there can be eligibility for one of these visas if the trafficker is being prosecuted and they work in conjunction with law enforcement for that. So I highlight that for you just in case you come across that in your work and you may need to pursue a T or a U visa for individuals who might need to avail themselves of that process. And from what we've been doing in terms of the Alliance, we find that to be a very underutilized process, which I have my own opinions about why that may be. But also, again, we're going to be focusing some additional education on that to make sure that law enforcement and others are aware that these visas are available when there is a trafficking victim. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking in a minute about the equality model, but also want to just reinforce in terms of advocacy and our own outreach, what I found from working with the Alliance is oftentimes what we can do locally can be some of the most effective. And so that can be participation in different, what I call pop-up events to raise awareness, events in response to different events that occur within communities. It can be getting yourself on an advisory body at the state, local, federal level, working within your church groups to raise awareness in those communities. And as I mentioned earlier, any of the prayer events and the webinars and coalition meetings with groups that you might not normally work with, but who can be helpful in carrying forth your message. So what I thought we'd move into now, Courtney, is talking about some of the main themes of the Alliance and our advocacy work. And one of the things that I thought would be helpful is to just sort of get a broad landscape about what do we mean by advocacy and where are we focusing some of our efforts. First thing we want to do is transform any policy that is considered unjust. So those would be practices, policies that harm survivors of human trafficking or who threaten those that are vulnerable. We also make sure that what we do in terms of our work is that it is survivor informed. And so we don't just come up with ideas on our own. We have a select group of individuals who help tell us if we're on the right track. They inform our work and they provide their perspectives as survivors of what needs to be done. And we take that information and we incorporate it into all of our advocacy. We could do a lot of work, but probably wouldn't get results if we don't talk a bit about root causes. And there are a number of things that cause human trafficking to proliferate. Of course, governments, businesses, and organizations have to be thinking about human rights and the basis of human rights as an approach to try and stop trafficking and exploitation. Personally, I feel that addressing some of the root causes, even if it's just one or two or a step in the right direction, that's where we need to be focused on in terms of eradicating human trafficking. We support investments in women and girls. We really want to promote programs that build the capacity of countries, both nationally, locally, internationally, to prevent discrimination and really give an equal footing to those who need education, make sure that they have property, security, land tenure, and inheritance rights. As I mentioned earlier, we require business transparency. So we do a lot of work in terms of trying to make sure that efforts are really trying to eliminate human trafficking. We do a lot in terms of child labor, focusing on that. And we have individuals who work with the UN in terms of guiding principles and some international work there. So, Courtney, if we could move ahead, I wanted to talk a bit about the equality model. And I think for your ministry, this is probably something that would be important to understand and what we do. I'm expecting, in terms of what I'm hearing, that the equality model is going to be some of the main advocacy that takes place in the States in next year. So what the heck do we mean by the equality model? You may have heard it called the Nordic or the abolitionist model. And really what this talks about is, in the context of sex trafficking, what some call prostitution, it is the best strategy for prevention and detection. And what we try and advocate and get our message out about in terms of this is, it's not the victim who should be prosecuted, it's the buyer. So in addition to getting that message out, we talk about decriminalizing those who have been prostituted or trafficked. We want to offer support and exit strategies for those who want to leave. And we hold accountable pimps, brothel owners, and buyers for their crimes. What I think it's important to note is some of the trends in terms of the advocacy for the equality model and what we've been seeing at the states. Maine was the first to enact this at the state level. And because of that momentum, I've been hearing that other states are going to look to Maine as a model or try and incorporate their own legislation at the state level that either is modeled on Maine or has their own version of the equality model. So we expect to build that into our work for 2024, and you'll probably be hearing more about that in the coming months as we start to engage with a number of individuals and organizations who are working on this as well. The other thing I think it's important to note for the equality model is there are a number of other proposals out there. Restitution for victims. So if, for example, the trafficker is held accountable, it's not just that they're being criminally prosecuted. In some cases, there are folks working to make sure that they would be compensated, victims, I mean, in terms of compensation for what the trafficker has done to them. And there are other policies around making sure that if a person does have a criminal conviction, but they've been trafficked, there's some work around expungement and getting that conviction off their records. So as those things continue and develop, I'm happy to come back and give some updates on that if there's anything that's of interest to the group, but want to highlight those in terms of some of the common themes that we're seeing. If we can move ahead to the next slide. What we've laid out here are really some of the key provisions of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And I put this in here simply because this was deemed to be sort of the first step at the federal level to make sure that victims could have some protection, some recourse. And it started out with the 3 Ps, which they call protection, prevention, and prosecution. But we also add to that partnership, because as this law was enacted, as I've mentioned, it's been amended a number of times to really enhance the provisions and provide for additional protections for individuals who have been trafficked. It also required what's called the Trafficking in Persons or TIP report to be issued. And I think that's an important document because it really gives a snapshot from the State Department view of what's happening in terms of trends. So each year the TIP report will come out and it will give us a sense about what's happening both domestically and internationally in terms of the effect that human trafficking is having in different regions and different areas. There are a number of federal agencies that work in response to human trafficking, and we do our best to outreach to them. We also are doing a number of outreach with private organizations. We have a number of organizations that we partner with to try and get the message out and also get support for our campaigns. So on the next slide, I mentioned that we are going to have a specific focus in terms of our advocacy campaigns, and one of which has to do with the human trafficking and migration work. And with respect to this, what we've found is that in our experience, people on the move have really been at particular risk for exploitation from their traffickers. And that's because of their social and economic circumstances, whether they are fleeing war, whether they are fleeing their country because of violence, personal violence, corruption, poverty, looking for a job. Once they're on the move, they become particularly susceptible to human trafficking. And we've got some statistics there from the International Organization for Migration and some statistics from Polaris, which I think many of you are familiar with. But we are going to be doing a lot of work in the coming year, and you'll be hearing more about this campaign in terms of migrants and what we hope to accomplish in terms of prevention, addressing root causes, and supporting legislation and policies that help address some of this. Next slide. So what does this mean for us? Where do we go from here? And, you know, in my work, I often think about my dad. And he always said he wanted to be remembered for doing the best that he could with what he had. And in many of our day-to-day lives, you know, maybe we can't change a law. Maybe we can't draft a specific bill that's going to get passed. Or maybe we did and we didn't get the momentum politically to get it passed. We have to be able to identify what we can do together and individuals to protect those who, on whose behalf we're actually doing the ministry and doing the advocacy work. And so I think, you know, from speaking with the group today, and I just want to reinforce that I'm available after today in terms of resource. I'm going to share with you a very good pamphlet that the Alliance has put out specifically for the prison ministry. But I think identification of resources, both in terms of the educational context, as well as resources for individuals that you're trying to help. You know, I mentioned the T and the U visas. That may be an option for some people, and you might need to avail folks of that. Partnership, I also think, is important. Partnership not just between us and your work and your organization, but partnering with other groups that maybe we haven't worked with in the past, or that maybe share our mission, but haven't really been involved in advocacy. We're really trying to expand a number of relationships there. And I think it's important to note that, you know, the point of this is really to have a common message. And as I mentioned earlier, your experience is your credential. Some of the most valuable and moving advocacy that takes place with respect to any of these political or legislative regulatory bodies has to do with the experience that you have in your day-to-day life. You know, anybody can cite a number. You can pull up a research report. You can give your perspective after having spent thousands of dollars trying to get a specific statistic and you know, researching data sets. But when you give the experience of an individual from their perspective and their voice, that is some of the most powerful advocacy messages that I've encountered, you know, in terms of my work. As I've mentioned, advocacy really can occur in different ways for different people. So in some contexts, you're working on behalf of one person. Maybe you're working on behalf of a group that's in a specific institution or prison. The ministry is really here to help us carry our message. And through our work together with advocacy, our goal is to do it together. Next slide. So what I offer here are a number of questions really to think about as we move forward in our ministry, what we should be thinking about in terms of the way forward. How can we help? What are we best equipped to do? What can we do for for families who want to support our work and our ministry? We've heard, I mentioned the informational brochure that I'm going to give you the link to in a minute. Many families have found that very helpful because they didn't realize that individuals who are incarcerated can be victims of human trafficking. Also, the sisters wanted me to reinforce that Women Religious and many other groups offer housing and support post-incarceration. So do you have recommendations for us about outreach and advocacy that we can be doing in this setting? I've mentioned a number of times education is a key for prevention. Tell us, give us your recommendations for groups where we should partner. I have a special place in my heart for juveniles and minors, and so you'll keep hearing me say about the special considerations there. Are there things we should be doing with that segment to raise awareness about human trafficking? Younger folks aren't going to read a 20-page document, detailing what human trafficking is. There's different ways to reach that audience, and so tell us if you have those ideas. And I didn't get into a lot of bills today because I didn't want to get sort of mired down in what might pass and what might not pass in the political environment. But if there are specific things that you think are hot in your area, whether that's a state law, a regulation, something that's happening federally, something that you want to push with your own representative, let us know. Tell us about your campaigns and your work, because maybe we can partner with you and join together in terms of a shared message. And as I mentioned, prayer is a huge part of our ministry. So if you have recommendations for the Alliance to help assist with that, let us know. We're going to be starting a prayer campaign in January that's going to go from January 11th, which is the National Day known for Human Trafficking Awareness, all through February 8th, which is the feast of St. Josephine Bakhita. We're going to be doing a prayer vigil every day. We're going to ask folks at a specific time to say a specific prayer. And so if you want to join us in that, we certainly can do that as well. So if we can jump ahead, I think I'm coming short on the end of my time, but I want to offer these resources that we have both in English and Spanish. We've gotten great feedback because it gives a very common sense approach about how those who are incarcerated can be trafficked and can be victimized. And so we've heard from a number of families they found it to be helpful. I encourage you to distribute that. If anybody wants paper copies, let me know. We can certainly send those to you. Those are the electronic links. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the human trafficking hotline. So for anybody who suspects that, certainly give the hotline a call. Don't try and take matters into your own hands. So let me stop there, Kara, Kim, Courtney, Karen. And I know we've got a couple other folks that may want to speak, but let me turn it back to you.
Thank you, Marilyn, for all of that useful information. And just want to remind people that the slides will be sent out to you. Catherine Sheffield is on from the USCCB. Do you have anything else to add for us today?
Thank you. And thank you, Marilyn, for a really wonderful presentation. The USCCB has worked for a really long time against human trafficking. And I just wanted to share kind of one quote that encapsulates that. The quote is, "The Catholic Church in the United States stands ready to work with our government to end this scourge. We cannot rest until trafficking in human persons is eliminated from the globe," end quote. And I know we're short on time, so I'm just going to put a couple links in the chat box where you can find more information about our efforts against human trafficking on our website, as well as an action alert so that you can sign up and find out more about the legislative advocacy that we're doing. Thank you all. It's always an honor to be with you folks.
Okay. Any questions Wait, I think I saw something that Karen had put in here and in the chat. Karen was asking, could you explain a little more about the T/U visas? Who is eligible and how and where do they apply?
It might be best, Kim, if I send that information afterwards. It can be a bit technical, but
Okay.
essentially individuals who have been victims of human trafficking get special consideration. And so there are different parameters if you go for the T visa or the U visa. And, you know, some of them you have to actually cooperate with law enforcement and there has to be a prosecution. But there are some helpful one-pagers that I can send that you can share with the group.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. As you were talking, or as I was thinking about this presentation, and I'm pretty sure that probably a lot of those that are coming in as immigrants now, we have an influx in Chicago that probably will be exploited in some way or human trafficked. Is there anything that I don't know how to notice that? A lot of times there's a language barrier, or there's just a desperation because the services, the wraparound services, are not available here.
Well, I think that's, Kim, one of the biggest challenges, and that's why we're going to be focusing a lot of our efforts on getting individuals in those situations available to work so that they don't have to rely on a trafficker or some other person who's presenting an opportunity that ends up with them being victimized. Right. We are going to have a full launch of a campaign, and I mentioned earlier that we're going to be doing some Hill visits. That's the message we're going to be carrying to the federal legislators with respect to that, in terms of that. Okay, great.
Mary Tracy had, how does this overlap with advocacy against modern day slavery, particularly in corporate and banking sector?
Well, advocacy, you know, as we've done is we've tried to include advocacy in all these different forums. So last year, I understand we had a very big effort in terms of going out to corporations and getting them to say, if you have contracts with subcontractors or vendors, you've got to have anti-trafficking provisions in there so that you can help us spot human trafficking, report it. And then there's a way to hold that vendor responsible so that if they are trafficking, that they can be terminated from the business relationship. So I guess, you know, to give a real life example, we were doing some work on the H-2A visa and the temporary and seasonal workers. They send recruiters, employers will send recruiters to other countries and say, come to the US, you can come here on a temporary basis and you'll have a job. Well, there are a lot of promises that can be made. And once the person gets here, a lot of things can happen. Either the work doesn't start on time, or the employer takes their documents that makes them vulnerable to trafficking. There are a lot of things that happen in that. And so there are provisions that we're supporting to say, okay, if you're going to hire a recruiter to make those kinds of representations, then you've got to have some contractual provisions addressing that so that people are aware of human trafficking, and also doing some disclosures to individuals about human trafficking and what that is, so they're aware that they're not vulnerable.
Right. Well, again, Marilyn, we thank you for being on today and sharing all this with us. And as always, we're glad that you joined us on this day. And we look forward to seeing you on next month. Thank you and have a blessed week.